Good morning and afternoon and hello to everybody. Welcome to this month's webcast, Cybersecurity Threats and Solutions for Nonprofits. Today's webinar is brought to you by 501c Agencies Trust. 501c Agencies Trust is the nation's oldest unemployment program. And if you're a 501c3 with over 15 employees, they could probably save you some money. So please feel free to contact them or visit their website. Many of you on today's webcast are already working with 501c Agencies Trust, and we really appreciate that relationship. I'm going to go through a bit of housekeeping right now before we get started. You can post any questions along the way in the questions area of the GoToWebinar application in front of you. The recording, we will answer those questions as we go, and then we will also save some for the end. So please keep those questions coming. This session is being recorded. You will get an emailed copy of this session along with a link to the slides about an hour, 60 minutes following the conclusion of the session. And I'll repeat that a couple of times. You will get a copy of the slides and you will get a copy of the recorded session. We do this once a month. Next month we have our annual Trends webinar. You'll get information about that following this session in an email as well, so please come back. And a quick tour, if you're not familiar with GoToWebinar, you have the questions area. Please feel free to shoot us any questions if you're having any audio problems or video problems. We'll see if we can get those squared out for you as well. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our speakers this morning. Let me get my notes going here. We'll start with Harvey. Harvey is a partner with PB Mayers. He's a leader of their financial services team and works on information technology consulting, including IT risk assessment, security review services, and network vulnerability testing. Dr. Eugene Fram is a professor emeritus at the Rochester Institute of Technology. He's served on nearly a dozen nonprofit boards. He's even chaired several others. You can read a lot of his work online in numerous publications. There's an attachment with references to a few of his works in the attachments area of the GoToWebinar software. Lillian is the president and co-founder of Baker, Romero & Associates. Her firm has been in business since 1986. They are a full-service commercial insurance agency, and they focus on the unique needs of the nonprofit sector. You can typically catch her conducting insurance seminars for colleges, universities, as well as nonprofits and local business communities. And finally, Mike is a litigator for TLD Law. He excels in several areas, which include business litigation, intellectual property, cyber law, and privacy issues. His practice includes counseling clients on the security and privacy issues affecting their organizations and personal lives. So as you can see, we have quite a team today. We do have a lot to cover. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to shoot those to us and we'll address those as quickly as possible. It's a big topic where there's no way we're going to be able to cover it all. So please feel free to follow up with our panelists following the webinar if you need information directly from them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Gene. And Dr. Fram, take it away.
Thank you very much, Mac. On behalf of the panel, I'd like to give the usual disclaimer that what we're giving you is the best advice that we have and should not be considered legal advice. On a personal basis, I would like to point out I have never been an ED and never have had ambitions to be one. In the words of your child poet, Ogden Nash, I would rather see than be one. Of course, your kids will all recognize that as being the purple cow. I'm currently serving on my 12th nonprofit boards with prior experiences ranging from national ones to startups. On the for-profit side, I have served on 5 boards ranging from listed companies to startups. My viewpoints that you're going to get here are strictly from the board level, not from the ED or the management level. As directors see it and as directors see the challenges they face on nonprofit boards. Can we have the first slides? Obviously, I don't need to tell you that both Sony Pictures and Target are nonprofits, and they've been hacked. If you've looked at the news this morning, you'll find the adult friend finder has been hacked. And I would assume that some people in the audience might be leaving quickly to talk to their spouses about what might appear on the web. And if you take a look at it, you say, well, look, I'm not, or our nonprofit is not Target nor Sony, nor are we involved with issues similar to Friend Finder. Let me give you a hypothetical situation, and it probably has occurred, but probably will continue to occur. Let's assume that you are on the board of a mental health organization, and a couple of high school students hack into your database, take the information from some of their friends that they quote they just don't like and put it out on the web. Now, in that case, it's more serious for you people, for the nonprofit, than it is for the Target or Sony, or perhaps even Friend Finder. I don't know. So the immediate reaction of many nonprofits is, well, we need to get a cybersecurity expert on our board to help us with those situations. The general consensus in both the profit and the nonprofit basis is that you don't need a person of that with that deep dives into those areas. What you need to be able to do is to ask certain questions that consistently to become familiar with those issues. And in any way, the legal people indicate to me that you have a due care responsibility, but simply by not having a cybersecurity person, or 10 years ago, a social media expert on your board won't make that much difference. So, and next slide, please. As a prelude to setting your cybersecurity policy, McKinsey and Company suggests that nonprofit directors be able to ask the following 5 questions. The first one, as you can see, centers on the relationship of what you're doing in the cybersecurity world with your core mission. And you know that you have tugs and pulls between the things that are nice to do and those that you have to do to prevent an attack. That's the first question that you need to ask. The second question relates to the hierarchy of projects. Which systems are most important to you? I would assume that for many nonprofits, that it's the donor list is very important, and it'll vary with the type of organization that you are. But it's setting this hierarchy is most important from the board level. Next and third is, how long does it take you to deploy features and functionality? If invested, how long does it take to get a payout for it? What's needed immediately to operate in case of a hack versus something that can be constructed? For instance, we talked about the donor plan donor list being critical, but the strategic plan can probably be reconstructed over a period of time. May I have the next slide, please? Next slide. All right. The fourth thing that McKinsey mentions: how efficient is your system for rolling out technologies and achieving desired outcomes? Outcomes become very important in this day and age because it's important to talk beyond outcomes and impacts. You can have outcomes without impacts. For example, Zuckerberg gave $100 million to Newark schools to improve the schools and to impact the students. It had great impact, great program impacts as it was set up, but it had zero impacts on the students on how they learned and their learning situation. Now, let's go to some board actions that those who are on board can take tomorrow morning. One is to make certain that all confidential information is carefully walled off. The private information from the 990 information. The private information might be client records and health records and things of that matter. The Form 990 information is going to be public anyway. If something happens related to that, that can be easily reconstructed. The next thing you need to do, next action you need to take and make sure that your management is doing, is to review the D&O and liability policies for CS coverage. It's my understanding that in most cases, your liability policy does not give you computer cybersecurity coverage. So that's one thing. And I even encountered one board that didn't have any D&O insurance. You might even find your board lacks that or lacks effective D&O insurance. For example, I encountered one board that was founded 17 years ago and had never had D&O insurance because they said it's just not going to happen to us. Yet the board had a financial responsibility for a $400,000 or $500,000 annual budget, and was responsible for over $50 million in real property without D&O. Another thing you need to take a look at that's relatively new is to see if you need a Plan A D&O policy. What you typically get, I understand, is what they call a Plan B D&O policy. You might ask yourselves, do we need the Plan A coverage? Lillian and I were talking about this just a few minutes ago, and she had said it's a very complex issue, but you ought to find out about it. Finally, is one area that very few nonprofit managers know about and are concerned about, and that is the Federal Intermediate Sanctions Act. If you want to write it down and check it out on the web, it's called IRS Section 4958. And this relates to giving excess benefits. If you as a director are involved with giving excess benefits to anybody, to a volunteer, to the ED, to a person in management, you can find that the IRS has an ability to add an excise tax to your personal income tax. And it's a very complex issue, and you should know about it so that you don't vote about it and vote on something that might yield an excess benefit. For example, I recently encountered a situation where the CFO of a nonprofit failed to add the vacation, extra vacation that the ED received, the monetary value. If the IRS had picked that up, that would have been an excess benefit there. And so all the board, having approved the action, could have been held liable. Fortunately, the external auditor picked it up, and a correction was made before the tax form went there. If you want to, I have an article published on this area. If you'd like to have it, please send me an email with your email to frameugene@gmail.com. It's also listed on the background material you'll get on the last slide. Next is the area of board encouragement, and that's important that meeting minutes are very careful about what's said about the area of cybersecurity, and they're accurate. Staff awareness, staff has to be know that it has to be reminded of the importance of cybersecurity. The last thing that we have to, last three things that have to be considered are you can get help from third-party payers, such as credit card companies, vendors. These are people who have sophisticated systems and would often be able to give you pro bono advice on what to do to protect your own accounts there. Another very good source for protection, I know you'll be surprised to hear, is the IRS. I've heard from an IRS official that if you call your district office of the IRS, they will send somebody and take a look at your systems there and advise you what they think you may need to do to prevent hacking. Another area is the area of educational and training of employees. Don't forget, a lot of the problems arise from employee lapses in their responsibilities. And finally, from the board perspective again, who should be in charge of it? And I think the two that are usually nominated are the board finance and audit committees. And immediately they will say, well, we really don't have time to do this. If not, I think you should ask them to make time. So thank you much. That's the word from the board level.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Fram. I want to continue with the theme here of governance for nonprofits, and for my section, I wanted to just spend a few minutes covering the top 5 cybersecurity controls or governance items that you should be doing at your organizations. These are items that can, excuse me, can be very effective, and in the grand scheme of things are relatively inexpensive items as far as resources that will be expended. Number 1 is performing an information or cybersecurity risk assessment. In order to best protect your organization, you have to understand where the critical data is and where it resides, and that's it's more difficult than it sounds. You certainly have to consider whether, if you're using third-party vendors, who has control and access to that data, as well as those systems are run in-house. And inventory your network is a great way to identify and really map out where could a cyber attack could happen. So if you understand your data and where it is, it's a lot easier to build controls that you feel will protect the network. Next slide, please. Number 2 is conduct routine vulnerability scans. These are very inexpensive and great ways to scan your network both externally and internally for weaknesses. Vulnerability scans on the external side will scan all internet-facing devices on your network and identify weaknesses where hackers most likely are to take advantage of an attack. So it's very technical based, but usually the fixes are relatively straightforward with respect to technical corrections upon the network. Internal scan is going to do the same thing except on your internally facing network. And it just really is a great tool for management and the board to understand where its control gaps are and how it can prioritize resources for fixing those items as a result of those scans. I would recommend doing them on a quarterly basis, monthly if you have the funds, but if not, certainly at least on an annual basis, you should be getting external and internal vulnerability scans. Next slide, please. There's a lot to this slide, a couple of different layers here, but the main theme is to centralize and control your configuration management and patch management. So basically what you want to do is establish a baseline security setting for all of your devices. So all laptops, all workstations, everything is configured the same. This will make it easier to manage those devices, as well as gives the organization a better understanding of what users can and cannot do. We work off the basis of need to know access, which would be controlled through your configuration management. So I always use the adage that employees can't screw up things they don't have rights to screw up. And so that's layman's terms for saying if they can install programs, if they can install applications on their workstations, you significantly reduce your risk for getting infected by a virus. So that's just a simple analogy of controlling on the need to know access, but that allows you, centralizing that process also allows you to make sure devices are updated with your most current antivirus and that everything in the organization is up to date. So that's a great kind of multi-layered control there to help administer and control access. I think we covered these, so to move on. You heard Dr. Fram talk about it. I'm going to mention it very briefly, as Lillian is going to spend her entire section talking about the importance of cyber insurance. Your governance process for your organization is not complete if you don't have cyber insurance, and more importantly, if you don't have the right cyber insurance. There's lots of different types of coverages, and what is applicable to you and your organization is going to vary from nonprofit to nonprofit. So very important that you spend the time talking with someone like Lillian about what types of coverages you need for your organizations, because it's a lot of misinformation out there. Moving on, please. Last but not least is to establish an incident response plan. If you go to any industry or network seminar, you're going to hear this common theme that there is no such thing as a secure network. There are well-managed networks. If JP Morgan Chase, if the State Department, if these organizations can be hacked who are spending millions and millions of dollars on their IT and security defense, I assure you your organization could be hacked. So it's the other thing you're fond of hearing is it's not a matter of if, but when you will be attacked. So the importance here is understanding that you are a target and that you need to be doing something. So there are two types of security breaches. There is a system or a network breach, and then there's an information breach. And if you actually are breached and lose information, that can be very critical and crucial to your organizations. Most nonprofits and small businesses that have an information security breach close their doors within 6 months of discovering that. So it's very, very important to have a plan in place to manage that risk in the event it happens. Incident response plan, not to be confused with disaster recovery planning. These are policies and procedures that focus specifically on security breaches. If we are breached, how are we going to communicate that internally to our employees? And more importantly, how are we going to communicate that to our members, our donors, our contributors, whoever it is our nonprofit is serving? That media communication, how's it going to happen? Who's going to do it? Who are our law enforcement contacts? What do we do? What do we do in the event of an attack? Ransomware is going rampant right now, and most of that is only paid in Bitcoins. So do you have a relationship with a third-party provider that provides cyber services? It's better to have that relationship now and know who you're going to work with versus kind of scrambling and trying to find someone at the last minute. So it's a complete review of all of those policies and procedures and things that are set up in place to respond to a breach. And I think that is the end of my section.
Okay, this is Mike Helbish here. I'm an attorney at TLD Law. We're out in California, so I'll say good morning. My presentation is going to discuss the process of developing internal and external data management policies so that the internal policies that the business or nonprofit has are effectively communicated outwardly and reflect those internal policies. The process of developing an InfoSec program will lead to a better understanding of your business and your privacy practices. This is crucial to a lot of businesses for everything from data recovery to data breach response to dealing with employees to just general management practices. Cybersecurity should be thought of interchangeably with privacy because the focus of cybersecurity is to keep certain information private. While it's more and more common for the general public to assume that cybersecurity is in place, the onus is on the businesses to take meaningful steps to ensure that these cybersecurity practices are put in place. But more importantly, as a external face for your business is to effectively communicate the privacy policies that the company has so that the general public and those people that you deal with either as third-party vendors or as customers or consumers or even the government understand what you're doing with the data that you have and what your practices are. Failure to do that or have discrepancies between the data policies and the actual practices can lead to a lot of liability, creates a lot of risk, and it can really cause damage to a business. The mnemonic I like to use is don't be caught empty-handed, and don't be caught empty-handed when you have a data breach and there's no response plan, or you get data in and someone asks, what are you doing with it? The way that we do this is we develop an InfoSec or an information management program by asking with four basic steps: discover, build, communicate, and evolve. The laws in the U.S. are usually sectoral. They don't really distinguish between for-profit or nonprofit status. So one of the first questions a CIO or some other officer at a nonprofit should ask is, what laws and regulations apply to my business, and what information do we have that would put us within the scope of that law? So starting with D, the first thing that a company needs to do is discover what information it has, what it collects, how it uses it. These are the initial questions, but more will follow when we get later on in the slide. The next one, B, build. Once you understand and discover what information you have, what you're doing with it, the process is to build an effective policy and build effective communication notices to the general public. This includes writing policies, discussing data practices at all levels, implementing the appropriate technical framework, and much, much more. C, communicate. This is the outward-facing aspect of your business. Information management is only as good as the method in which it's communicated. So care must be taken to communicate policies to the public and internally to the company employees. That's a key factor here, because you can have the best privacy notice on your website or anything like that, but if your employees aren't unaware of what your goals are for cybersecurity and for privacy issues, then it's not going to be implemented effectively, and you're going to have a discrepancy between what you're telling the public and what you're actually doing. And finally, E, for evolve. Information management can't be static. It has to evolve with the ever-changing legal, technical, and business landscapes. You know, like Harvey said, there should be periodic, even quarterly audits. You know, assessments should be done every time a new technology or business plan is adapted or adopted, and you know, move forward from there. So let's go on with the next slide, please. So this is kind of the first critical question for developing any information management policy is, what personal information are we collecting? It seems like an obvious one to ask, but there's a lot more than most people think. To really answer the question, a business needs to understand which laws or regulations govern their business and how those laws define personal or protected information. If you're in a healthcare setting, it's going to be different than if you're in a financial setting, and different than if you're in the insurance setting, things like that. So from there, businesses need to determine how sensitive their data is. Is there confidential information, proprietary, sensitive, or even public information? One of the things that people overlook as a nonprofit a lot is their proprietary information in their own business, whether it's a trade secret or you know, internal policies or programs that have value if by the fact that they remain secret. A nonprofit must also determine how their data is collected, from whom it's collected, and when security starts for that information. You know, simply having technical restraints on your computer isn't enough if the employees that obtain that information don't have the understanding of what they're supposed to do to protect the data they're collecting. As a baseline, most businesses I've come across fail to ask themselves the question of what information are they collecting. You know, for example, a business that I know collects the name and address and phone numbers of its customers, but ignore the fact that they have social security numbers of its employees. So the question is, what information are we collecting should be asked at every entry point for data into the company. Next slide. Then from there, the next logical question is, what are we doing with that information? And the reason you ask this is there's a lot of personal data that is collected from a lot of businesses solely for the purpose of collection. There's no real need for that business, and what that creates is a risk that you don't need, and potential liability that you shouldn't have. Social securities don't always need to be collected. Credit card numbers don't need to be stored after a transaction unless there's a good purpose for it. A risk-conscious information manager should understand that collection and storage of data should be weighed against the risks of breach of that data. Do you really need the information that you're collecting? The second reason to ask what the company is going to do with the data is determine and implement security measures. If the purpose of a particular datum is to process a transaction from a customer, the marketing team doesn't need to access that data. Segregation of information is important to protect against the breach of that data. It's also important to identify where to look in the event of a data breach. If you're sharing data with a third-party processor, you need to be aware of what data you have and what data you're sharing, and asking yourself what you're going to do with the data will help model a plan and a data map. Next slide, please. So data mapping is this idea that it's the process of discovering, inventorying, documenting data flows, and determining accountability. It literally can look like a map of a flow chart of where the data comes in, who gets to access it, how it's used, and the whole life cycle of that data when it's destroyed. One of the big problems a lot of businesses have is they keep data longer than they need. They store it, and once it gets into that storage phase, it's often forgotten, and a lot of liability arises from that. That's not just on the cyber level, it's on the physical level as well. If you have a bunch of documents in a warehouse somewhere, there's liability that exists for that information. So a company needs to look at what it's doing with that data and how the life cycle of that data flows. We want to find out if the applicable laws dictate specific data protection practices. We want to ask ourselves how the data is to be used. Is it aggressively used, or is it cautiously? For example, do we want to use data for more than one purpose, say fulfilling a transaction, then also setting marketing information? If that's the case, then we need to identify that use and that multifaceted use of the data and communicate that process outwardly, that practice outwardly. Do we want to have a cautious use of data? Do we want to have a practice of limiting data storage to avoid liability? Do we want to have a practice of limiting data access to specific individuals? Asking those questions is important to really tailor the idea of a data map. Who gets to use it, and how do we understand where our liability arises? Laying out a data map also involves identifying the specific individuals or departments that will have access to the data during its lifetime. For example, does the sales team have access to everything? Does the IT department get access to payroll files? Does HR need to access proprietary trade secrets? Making the map is going to determine where accountability arises. Next slide, please. So the next is what is the organization's actual data practices? If you look at data mapping, the idea is to determine what this is. What is the organization doing in terms of its data practices, and how does that compare with what it's supposed to be doing, what it thinks it's doing, and what it's telling others it's doing? Those are big questions that they need to be asked so that you can have a consistent data privacy practice and effectively communicate that to the outside world. The map needs to know where your personal information comes from and where it goes. We kind of already discussed that a little bit. And then, more importantly, who has access to your personal information, who uses it, and who is accountable. I think both Harvey and Dr. Fran talked about vendor management. It's really, really important to determine what information a third party has, what contractual language is in place with those third parties, and to determine who's going to do what in the event of a data breach. And so you can have that plan in place. Next slide, please. So we've kind of we've discovered everything about the data, where it is, where it comes from, who sees it, who uses it, who shares it, who destroys it. And then we want to build the appropriate models, maps, and infrastructure to make sure that our intended information management program is in operation. We need to communicate that program both internally and externally. Next slide, please. So privacy policies versus privacy notices. Policies are the internal documents that you have and you share with your employees. They can be part of your employee handbook or a separate document, but the key is that privacy policies should be the communication of your information management program to the appropriate employees and personnel. The only way to make sure that your business follows this info management plan and ultimately protects its data is to effectively communicate that plan. Everyone needs to be on the same page in terms of what their roles are, what their expectations are, what their limitations are. And a business should determine whether or not multiple policies are needed depending on the employees, the laws, the goals of the program. It needs to be tailored to your personal business or your nonprofit so that you can understand how the data is mapped and who shares in accountability. Privacy notices, in contrast, are the outward-facing communication of your promises to the consumer regarding their data. It's also the third parties in which you share data. A privacy notice must be transparent, meaning it must accurately reflect that company's data practices. And you can see that to accurately reflect the company's data practices, you need to discover and build your program so that you know what those data practices actually are. Data practices also create accountability. Companies that don't follow their own posted data practices can face liability from consumers, government entities like the FTC or state attorney generals, and even from shareholders. It's extremely critical that privacy notices and privacy policies are consistent with one another. Next slide, please. So in building policies or communicating policies, the goal of the company is in protecting the data. For example, if you discover that many employees have access to a company's personal data on their BYOD devices, then you may want to communicate a policy that requires the installation of data wiping programs on their devices, or require them to implement a password, or at a bare minimum have encryption on those phones or laptops, etc. The goal should be shared with the employees who have the responsibility of promoting the company's values to both other employees and to the consumer public. Salespeople should understand what the data privacy goals are, so that if a consumer asks them, that they are able to communicate those effectively. A website privacy notice should be clear and concise and highlight the main points about the data practices, so that customers or consumers feel confident about that business. It's really a reputational risk you're dealing with here. Understanding that people are going to read those privacy notices, even if most don't, some will, and you want to back up what you say. How business communicates its policies internally will ultimately affect how well it protects its data, and how it communicates its policies externally is going to be a big issue for accountability of a business as a whole. Next slide, please. So communication internally, this is fairly straightforward, and some of the other panelists have covered it. You want to have training for internal audiences on policies and procedures. Part of communicating the company's policies is to effectively train the employees. Communication of these goals should be made clear so that management can utilize their best practices to effectuate those goals. Examples of training for cybersecurity could be phishing tests on emails, mock DDoS attacks in the event of a cyber breach, scenario-based quizzes for the C-suite level. There are many companies out there who provide employee and C-suite level training for cybersecurity. It's a good idea if you feel like there's a lot of risk, that you look into those programs and really test, at least on a director or officer level, that people are aware of how these things happen. Next slide, please. Communication externally. I somewhat covered this, but it bears repeating that the cyber notices, the privacy notices, should be consistent with the company's internal practices. There's a good example of this with Facebook. In 2011, the FTC sued Facebook, alleging that it had deceived customers by repeatedly making changes to its services that made previously private information public. You may, if you use Facebook at all, you remember they came out with these changes, and then people had to go back and figure out what was now made public, what was private. Well, the FTC got involved, and they charged they charged Facebook with deceptive practices. Facebook ultimately settled, but what they were required to do was to provide a clear notice and get consumer consent from users before making retroactive changes to its privacy terms. And it also required Facebook to have third-party audits of its privacy program biannually for 20 years. So there is a real cost and reputational risk to your business if you fail to follow your privacy notices. That's why making sure that your practices are consistent and clear and understood is really, really important. And finally, last slide. The last thing is the evolve step. Review and update your program and policies on a consistent basis. Regularly scheduled reviews on all levels, from IT to HR to the C-suite. Update with every new change or adoption in a new technology and a new piece of data and a new business plan, and then continually training and the reiteration of concerns with your employees and the appropriate people within your organization to make sure that your privacy and your data security programs are effective and consistent and up to date. And with that, I'll pass it off to the lovely Lillian Romero Gomez.
Thank you, Michael. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. As Michael said, my name is Lillian Romero Gomez. I am president of Baker Romero and Associates, and I'm proud to say that we have been insurance brokers specializing in nonprofits for over 30 years. Clearly 30 years ago, cyber risk management didn't exist, and in the insurance industry, cyber insurance is difficult to catch up because the technology changes and insurance moves at a snail's pace. Next slide. Cyber insurance should be viewed as part of your risk management plan. It should not be viewed as your risk management plan. I wanted to put a little bit of levity into this because literally when I walk into nonprofits, whether they're small or large, I can't tell you how many times this picture, this cartoon is what I'm facing. Sometimes it's like my clients, whether they're large or small, are in the Stone Age when it has to do with cyber risk management. Dr. Fram, Harvey, and Michael have reviewed various critical aspects of risk management. And remember that risk management deals with the uncertainty of risk, and it's about being prepared for that uncertainty. And rest assured that if it doesn't happen within your organization, some type of cyber attack will happen to an organization that you already know of. Next slide. Most nonprofits have a cyber risk exposure. I have had clients that are 100% volunteer run saying, we don't have to worry about that, we're good to go. When you go through this slide and your own time, remember that the critical aspect here is that most nonprofits carry a cyber risk exposure. And in your risk management plan, you have to decide how you and the board are going to deal with it. Next slide. From an insurance perspective, we tend to look at exposures in terms of perils. That's the big word in the insurance industry. What are the perils? So when we're looking at what are the perils in a computer network so that we can figure out if we can insure them, with regard to a computer network, this is what we're looking at. Virus transmission, fraud, hacker attack, power failure, human error, that's a big one, system malfunction, employee sabotage, or whatever a rogue employee wants to do, and natural disasters. So what you need to ask yourself is, where is your organization vulnerable? And if you don't know where to start, seek some professional assistance, because this is where organizations are most vulnerable from an insurance perspective. Next slide. I wanted to briefly share with you, these are actual claims, incidents that we get in our office every day. Unfortunately, as the insurance broker in the group, we are the ones that ultimately hear when something goes wrong. The first actual claim that we got, this is just about 6 months ago, was what many clients have already felt or experienced, was that a desktop computer was stolen from a nonprofit which contained all employees' Social Security numbers. Don't ask me why it was there or why it was in that particular setting, other than they believed that nobody would go after them. An attorney is working with them. Unfortunately, this client didn't carry any cyber insurance, and they're dealing with an attorney at this point to help them. The next example of an actual claim that has come through our doors has to do with a CFO who received an email from their new CEO requesting payroll records. She was working from home that day, working on the budget, perfectly normal thing to do. Clearly, someone in the office was aware of their operations and hacked this email. This was a phishing email, and over 150 employees' payroll information is out in the world. With this particular account, they did have cyber insurance, and they're getting risk management assistance to help them in handling this claim. And the last one, and I brought this one intentionally because clients tend to forget, nonprofit clients rather, tend to forget that sometimes the interns or the volunteers are the ones that may present a claim, mainly because they're not trained. or properly trained. In this particular case, it was college interns that posted pictures of logos which they did not get permission. And the company that came back and threatened to sue them basically said, get these logos off or pay us for the use of the logos. And it was taken care of. There wasn't a lawsuit. But again, I bring that here because lots of times you're not thinking about what your volunteers and interns are doing or how well they are trained. Next slide. And let's go on to the next one because I don't want to. Go ahead and read these. These give you actual examples of claims, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on them. Know that we get actual claims and lawsuits all the time having to do with nonprofits. All right, so I put this slide in here because when I go out and see clients, whether they're large or small, remember they're all nonprofits, these continue to be the 4 cyber misconceptions, is what I call them, as to why people feel they don't need nonprofit insurance. And I hear this all the time. The number one reason is I am a small nonprofit, so no one's going to want to target us. We're too small, Lillian. We're not going to buy insurance. It's too costly. And my response to that is that studies have consistently shown that what the hackers are now looking for aren't the big targets of the world, but they're looking for small organizations that are quick and easy to get in and get out. So there's a false sense of security if you feel that your small nonprofit is not a target. The next one we get is I outsource my data to a third-party vendor or to a cloud provider. And my response to that is I think that's great, but you should read your contract or have an attorney read your contract, because most of the contracts that we have read having to do with a cloud provider puts the liability back on your organization. It does not assume it. I have heard that there are some that are now, but we in our agency have not seen that. So have your attorney look that over. The third reason that nonprofits say they don't need cyber insurance is because we have a great IT department. Our IT security is top-notch. And my response to that is, I think that's great that you're doing that. That's important. That's part of your risk management. But lots of times the type of attack that you're going to get is not going to be protected by an IT department. It could be an unhappy employee. There are lots of other things that can go wrong. Remember that section we talked about perils? There's other things that can go wrong. And then the fourth thing that we commonly get is that my funding sources do not require that I purchase cyber coverage, so it must be covered under another policy, or we don't need it. And my response to that is that this is your responsibility, your board of directors' responsibility, as to what you should and should not get. Just because a funding source is telling you that they don't require it doesn't mean that it's not needed. Next slide. So cyber insurance. Just so that you'll know, it's been around, cyber insurance has been around about 20 years for the big corporations, but it started selling business in middle America, middle-sized accounts about 10 years ago. Cyber insurance is a special form of commercial insurance, and it was created to protect businesses against cyber attacks and various other computer problems or security problems that may have. But here's the thing. There is no such thing as a standard policy form. There is a move towards standardization as more and more insurance companies are coming in to write cyber insurance. There is a move toward that, but it doesn't exist right now, which means that you, your attorney, your board of directors need to carefully understand what it is that you're buying. Next slide. So what to look for in a policy? The one thing that I can say that is standard, if you can call it that, for cyber insurance right now is that most policies are written on a claims-made form, much like your miscellaneous professional liability or your directors and officers liability. Most policies are written on a claims-made form. And what this means is that coverage will only apply to those claims that are first made during the policy period. So if something happens before you have the policy and you don't hear about it until the policy is enforced, there is no coverage in place. So you need to be aware of that when you are talking to your insurance broker. Next slide. this is just a back to basics, and these are just some very quick tips on any insurance that you buy, but especially with a cyber policy. You need to make sure that the insurance company that you are with is a strong financial company. There is a rating company that rates the financial condition of most insurance companies. It's called BEST, and there are several other. But in the insurance industry, we focus on the BEST rating, which is very simple, A, B, C, D, and F. You want companies that are best A rated. And the other thing to ask your insurance broker is the insurance company an admitted insurance company or a non-admitted insurance company? If it is an admitted insurance company, it is going to be part of your state's guarantee association. If it is not, you have no protection under the guarantee association. So discuss that with your insurance broker. And know that there are various cyber forms where you can add and delete coverage. And again, that's something you should discuss with your insurance broker, and I recommend an attorney. Next slide. But before you start to look for cyber coverage, because of the trends that are going on in this country with regard to cyber attacks, many insurance companies are now starting to add some form of cyber coverage onto the general liability policy, your directors and officers policy, your property policy or crime policy, and also various miscellaneous professional liability forms. It's limited coverage, but there is some there. So before you start to look at an actual cyber policy, make sure that you understand what, if anything, do I currently have. Next slide. These are just 3 companies that we work with all the time, and there are several others that already provide cyber liability coverage under their policies. Now remember, it is limited. USLI, a big insurance company, it's United States Liability Insurance, has a program for nonprofits under their directors and officers liability, and they offer $50,000 of data breach coverage. NIAC, Nonprofits Insurance Alliance of California, under their general liability form, they include data breach under the liability for the full limits, so it's a great coverage. And then Great American Insurance, this is just another example because they write lots of nonprofits. Under their business package policy, you can add data compromise coverage, first party and third party coverage, I believe up to $500,000 at a very affordable price. And these are just 3 companies. These are not standalone cyber policies, but they are part of other coverages, and you need to look at that. Next slide. As I said, about 60, I think it's now 65 insurance companies are writing standalone insurance policies. And while there is nothing standard about them, one thing you should know is that most of them are scalable. And what I mean by that is you can pick and choose the coverages you want or that you need so that you're not buying coverages that you don't need. Again, each insurance company underwrites their own coverage form, so work with your insurance broker to understand what you are getting. The bottom line is that cyber insurance, cyber risk management is continually evolving, so you need to do your research. Next slide, please. The minimum premiums, and I'm referring to California, but I'm assuming that they're true nationwide. The minimum premium for $1 million cyber liability policy in California for a nonprofit ranges between $1,000 to $1,500 a year. And the premiums are based, generally speaking, on your total revenues, the number of records within your agency, the level of cyber risk controls, and Michael has talked about some of the things that you need to be doing or considering, staff training, how is your HR involved and what type of education are you providing your employees, and of course if there's any claim history. And again, there are additional coverages that can be purchased if it's an organization that needs additional types of coverages other than what is offered. Next slide. As I said, general liability or your cyber policy is not standard, but generally what you're going to find under a cyber policy is a liability section, a first party section, a crime section. Go on to the next slide. The crime section, and go on to the next slide. and then there's an area that might cover penalties and also a crisis management. This is not what you're used to looking at. And remember, you can piece this together, but I wanted to focus on this last slide because lots of times what we forget when we're buying insurance is that maybe what you need most is some type of crisis management service, or you need a policy where if you do get hit with some type of regulatory fine, that someone's going to pay for it, because these can be costly. Next slide. Again, be aware of sublimits. Every policy offers sublimits, and be aware of the exclusions. I was actually going to put a slide up here that listed exclusions, but then I realized every company does it differently, so I didn't do that. And the most important thing with regard to a claims-made form, be aware of the retro date. Ask your broker about that. Next slide. These last couple of slides just have to do with the type of questions I want you to take some time looking at when you go back. This is what the insurance companies are going to ask, and it's based on these questions as to how they're going to determine your premium. They're going to look at how well are you protecting your organization, thank you, before you buy insurance. So these are important for you to go back and ask yourself, what are we doing and what are we not doing? Because that's going to tell you if you're insurable. Okay, last slide. So I want to leave you with this final thought. There is no way that your organization can create 100% cybersecurity, but having strong internal controls and employees trained can help reduce your claims. Events are going to happen, ladies and gentlemen, and so I challenge your organization, its employees, volunteers, interns, and board of directors to prepare now for the unexpected. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Lillian. So we have gone over our time, but we're going to stay here and answer questions if you want to go ahead and send those in. We have a couple in the queue already. Guys, a lot of times when I don't see a lot of questions on a panel, it makes me feel like sometimes it's kind of overwhelming for the audience. Not that they know everything we just covered, but that they're kind of overwhelmed with all the information. I think that's maybe what we have here a little bit today. We do have one question from David. Did somebody during this section mention patch management, and can you explain exactly what that is? Anybody?
Sure. David, patch management is that process of making sure all of your devices, and that includes cell phones these days, but primarily your laptops, your workstation, those devices that do connect to the internet, you want to make sure that they're protected with antivirus software, or to the extent that your systems run off of key systems that get updated, just like Microsoft releases updates for Windows. It's a central process. Patch management is the process of installing those updates, installing them across the broad spectrum of the organization. So the extent you can centralize that and have IT be responsible for updating the network for all of the patches, all of the antivirus, all of the updates to the systems, it just makes your organization more efficient, and it ensures that security baseline that I was talking about, that all workstations have the same amount of protection.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Next question from Miguel about third-party hosting services. Should our audience be conducting some kind of audits of those third-party systems just to cover liability? What are your all thoughts about monitoring third-party systems?
This is Mike. I definitely think that the review should be of the contractual language to see who's going to be covering what in the event of a data breach, making sure that you know what information and particularly private information or protected information is going out to that third party. And in terms of auditing that company, if you have the market power or the ability to do that, it's definitely not a bad idea. I don't know that a lot of companies open their doors to that type of that type of look inside their, their gears to see. But if it's something you're able to do, then definitely.
Well, and I'd just like to add that a lot of organizations have what are called a service, that are these third-party providers, have what are called service organizational control audits, or they're called SOC audits. So your Microsoft Azure, all of your other big third-party data providers, most of them, especially that have mass quantities of customers, are getting that question from others. So what they do is they issue a common report, if you will, this service organizational control audit, and in it, it will describe the company's system, the auditor's test of those controls, and their effectiveness. It also gives you a good breakdown of what are called user controls, controls that the user organization, the nonprofit in this case, should implement to ensure that those systems are working properly. That's very common.
This is Gene. When I mentioned the IRS, I had a feeling a lot of people had their hair stand up on that one. But the IRS is anxious to get into companies and to nonprofits to help them prevent cyber attacks. And as I heard from the representative of the IRS a few months ago, they're very anxious to come in and try to be helpful to you, and I guess at no cost, in terms of helping you to do that.
Thank you. We have a question from John, who's talking about performing network vulnerability tests. Do you all think or have any opinion as to whether or not that should be done in-house, or should nonprofits typically find a third party to do that type of thing for them? Any thoughts or opinions about that?
I think that kind of depends on how sophisticated your in-house person is, whether or not they're comfortable doing that. And whether or not they have the capabilities of doing that sort of in-house audit. But definitely a third party would be, especially someone with like Harvey said, a certification that they can demonstrate that they have that capability would be a good option.
Okay. All right. Well, that will do it for today. I appreciate everybody, panelists. Thank you all so much for your time and energy. I know we covered a lot. To everybody out there, thank you for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you again in a couple weeks as we cover legal trends for nonprofits to look out for next year. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week.